I want to give you a little bit of personal background on how I first got into this, and then I want to show a 35-minute film. It's a British film. It's not actually macrobiotic, it's vegan, but it raises some important issues and will give me a way to talk about how macrobiotics differs from veganism and what the Asian culture that is its source means in terms of its worldview and its way of looking at everything in the world. So, in 1986, I was a professor at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, and I lived in Yellow Springs, Ohio, which some people called the fairyland capital of the Midwest. It was the home of Antioch College. It was run by a kind of Quaker mafia who were the establishment. It had a coffee shop where Pravda was sold. It had 2 organic grocery stores. This is in 1986, 2. And in one of them especially, there were all kinds of strange products like miso and a bunch of sea vegetables with strange names like wakame and kombu and arame and iziki. And there were also little flyers about macrobiotic cooking classes. So I was intrigued because the truth was I was in midlife and I was having one ailment after another. None of them, thank goodness, were of a life-threatening nature, but I just kept noticing that one thing would get fixed and then another thing would break, and these were on my body. And so I started attending the cooking classes to see what I could find out. And as I did that, I bought my first macrobiotic cookbook. And it was written by Aveline Kushi, who was the wife of Michio Kushi at the time, the foremost macrobiotic educator in the United States. And he just recently died in December, actually. So Aveline's cookbook was titled Complete Guide to Macrobiotic Cooking, for Health, Harmony, and Peace. And it was like, health? Okay. Harmony? Peace? This does not sound like Betty Crocker or Fanny Farmer. I never saw a subtitle like that on their books. And then I opened the introduction, and she wrote, food quality is the key to health and happiness. Changing the quality of food on a global level is the key to ending the spread of cancer, heart disease, mental illness, and infertility in the modern world. Notice how they get more and more grandiose in their claims, as well as reversing the breakdown of the family, social disorder, and mistrust between nations. Wow. So I'm a religious studies professor, right? And I smell something that smells a lot like what I'm used to dealing with. So I got really interested in this. So then I read this book by Michio Kushi, One Peaceful World. It's semi-autobiographical, and it's collection of essays that wander through his life to the point that he wrote it, which was some years ago. But anyway, he explains how he got interested in macrobiotics. And it turns out that the young Michio Kushi was a student at the University of Tokyo. And he was a graduate student, and he was in something called world government, and that's what he was interested in. And while there, he encountered a man named George Osawa, who was the director of a little study house on the outskirts of the university that was called Maison Ignoramus, the house of the ignorant, of those who do not know. They would have dinners. A lot of them sounded, I think, somewhat like your dinner, your sticky rice dinner. And Michaud shows up one night, and he has this little exchange with George Osawa that he reports in the book. And Osawa says to him, who is this food radical, he's a Japanese foodie, I guess you could say, and he comes out of several centuries of Chinese food philosophy as imported into Japan, and all of the worldview that represents, which I'll get into later. And George Osawa says, have you ever considered the dialectical application of dietary principles to the problem of world peace? The dialectical, I still don't know what that means. The dialectical application, I mean, I know what it means to be dialectical, but the dialectical application of dietary principles to the problem of world peace. And Michio Kushi gives the right answer. I never thought of that. George Osawa says, you have to study the relations between food and human destiny. Someday you will find that it is the key to world peace. Every week, please come and eat with us. So Michio Kushi does, and after a while, Norman Cousins, who some of you may have heard of, he's most famously known for laughing himself out of a serious disease by showing funny films to himself. Well, he also apparently had money, and he paid to bring Michio Kushi to America, and Michio became a student at Columbia University in political science. He dropped out of the program. Part of the problem was his abysmal inability to learn English, and he just couldn't, make it. But he was a brilliant man who taught himself by very keen practical observation. He used to stand in front of Horn and Hardarts. Does anybody besides me know what Horn, you know what Horn and Hardarts is? Okay, Horn and Hardarts was this cafeteria chain, and you went in, you put a quarter in the slot, and out popped your ham sandwich or your apple pie or whatever you wanted to eat. And he used to stand in Times Square where there was a Horn and Hardart, and he would look at people in the window, and he would watch what they were eating, and he would look at their facial physiognomy, what their faces looked like, and he began to make correlations between what they looked like and what they were eating, and then as he began teaching and counseling between what those faces looked like and what they were eating and what kinds of diseases they were getting. So it was fascinating and intriguing, and I was really getting excited about this. And as I learned more about the philosophical background behind it, I got even more excited because unlike what I was trying to do, I was trying to be a healthy person, and I was trying to avoid spending thousands of dollars on medical tests to figure out why my digestion was so bad and things like that. And so I would read something and they would say, oh, you need copper. And I'd go out and buy copper pills. And they'd say, oh, your hydrochloric acid is not sufficient. And I'd go buy hydrochloric acid pills. And, and I had all these supplements that I was taking to try to create a better digestive climate, probiotics, enzymes, you name it, I was doing it. So what fascinated me about the approach that he represented rather than this approach was that while I seemed to have a Band-Aid approach, the latest scientific test says use X, go out and buy X, he presented a comprehensive worldview where everything fit into place, and where you kind of had a great chain of being, to use the Western expression, between what you put in your body and the planet, and not only the planet, but the ethers, but the spiritual reverberations from a grand infinity. And so it was really, to use theosophical in the small t sense, it was a theosophical worldview and a philosophical worldview that he presented. And not only that, it was elegant and it was aesthetically pleasing. And I've always thought that the way to understand religion, my field, is through aesthetics. So this was turning me on. And not only that, I found as I started dealing with this and dealing with my juvenile delinquent stomach that it worked. And I was getting better, not overnight, but like Chinese herbs, if you've ever taken Chinese herbs, the long haul, slowly, gradually. And as I stayed with this approach for years, I noticed that I wasn't aging the way that people my age aged. I didn't seem to have all the diseases that people my age had. I had no arthritis. I was not wearing trifocals. I was wearing drugstore glasses, 1.50, just because I want to not have to strain. I have no osteoporosis, and the list went on and on and on and on. And so I thought, this is great. This is really great stuff. And I'm at a place now with my wonderful UCSB pension that I can share some of this and talk about some of this. So that's my background. By the 1990s, I started getting involved in leadership training courses, but it was with the speed of a snail. And in December of last year, 2 weeks before Michio Kushi's death, I graduated finally from level 4 at the Kushi Institute. It only took me 22 years. So, the slow learner. Right? So, that's my background. And macrobiotics has often been confused with veganism or vegetarianism or seen as a subset. And it's true that we share certain basic ideas and like we're fellow travelers in many respects. But it also comes from a profoundly different point of view. And it's one that I would call vitalistic. It's based on energy. Whereas, as I understand, a vegan approach, it is more based on the structure of certain foods, a more structural approach. So what I'd like to do is, I'd like to show a short version of a film called Plan Eat, and it's a British film. And some of you may have seen the Colin Campbell film Forks Over Knives.
We showed it here last year.
Yeah, I know that you did. They are some of the characters in this film, so you will hear them repeating their argument. But why I like this film as a different voice from Forks Over Knives, good as that one is that it really talks more about the planetary consequences of what we eat. So it talks about the health consequences, it talks about the planetary consequences. As I reflect on the issues, I don't think they're all that different, because I think, and I'm going to argue, that our personal health is an ethical issue every bit as much as what we're doing to trash our environment and how we're helping people to starve to death by our dietary habits. Not that we personally have pushed the button to do this, but because we belong to a collective culture that produces food and distributes food in certain ways and in certain categories. As I see it, there are 4 major categories of ethical concerns that come from what we put in our mouths. One that was covered the most extensively there was the environmental consequences. A second that was touched on briefly was world hunger and distribution issues of food. A third that wasn't mentioned at all, except by implication when you saw the girls coming in that episode of The Small Family Farm, is animal welfare concerns and how animals are treated. And a fourth that was mentioned, but not as an ethical issue, but that I think is very strongly an ethical issue, is our own health. Okay? So let me start backwards since the film went the other way. Our own health, I believe, is an ethical issue for 3 reasons at least. And the first is that if we do not respect our own physiology in light of massive information that we have about what's going to extend our lives, what's good for us, then what in the world is our basis for respect for any other life form on the planet? You know, if you trash yourself, why would you respect a cow? You know, it just doesn't compute. So, in other words, what we do and how we treat ourselves is point 0 for how we deal with the rest of the world. The second implication is that we are not alone. We are part of communities. We are part of families. We are part of groups. And when there is a tear in our dike, it doesn't just affect us. If anybody knows somebody who got cancer at age 46 and then died, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, like the grief, the pain, the disruption that comes to a whole community because of the sickness of one is something that we cannot look away from. It's true, none of us gets out of this alive. But there's a real difference between kicking the bucket at 92 and kicking the bucket at 46, you know? So that's a second implication. And the third ethical implication, I think, has to do with the way we are collectively and legally organized to deal with sickness. We have insurance, okay? And it doesn't take much observation to know that healthcare costs are getting way, way, way out of line, consuming proportionately more and more of our budgets and the government's budgets and the national product. And you know, if you ate broccoli instead of beef more often, maybe that wouldn't be the case. Maybe healthcare costs would come down, okay? The collective organization of our society. So I think all 3 of those are ethical issues, starting with the individual, moving to communities, and then to our collective and legal organization of our care of ourselves. On the matter of animal welfare, I show another film. I teach classes at the Unitarian Society, and I have another film called Vegecated, which in many respects horrified us, both because of what it showed about animal welfare issues and because of the kind of unbalanced way it approached veganism. In one shot in the film, one of the protagonists holds up a box of Oreos that she's discovered on a supermarket shelf, and she says, "They're vegan." And I was like, oh, my whole class groaned. So that was the bad part of that film. But the good part was that it really got into the whole issue of the way animals in these agribusiness locations are treated, the way they live a life of total suffering, and the way they die. And it ain't pretty. It really ain't pretty. Paul McCartney once said that if slaughterhouses were built of glass, everybody in the world would turn vegan. And and even those lovely cows, the girls that were kind of plodding through the films and looking really happy, when the time comes to slaughter them, which it must, he doesn't have a slaughtering operation there. They're going to be shipped with all the other agribusiness raised cows, and they're going to be slaughtered. And it's horrifying. Like, some people have, well, there's this thing about a little, there was a television show that Dateline NBC in 2001, they snuck into a slaughterhouse, and they did these tapes to find out what was going on, and they showed struggling cows hoisted upside down and butchered while they were still alive. They showed animals being skinned alive and the legs cut off while they were alive. They showed animals being hit repeatedly with stunning devices that didn't work, being shocked with electric prods, and these were shoved into cows' mouths. So it's really horrible. It's just horrible. And John Robbins, in his book Diet for a New America, has these stories of pig farms where they're like apartment houses, and they're one on top of the other, and the pigs on the bottom get all the feces from the pigs on the top, and pigs are not naturally a dirty animal, but they were made dirty, and so they live miserable, miserable lives, unlike the cows that you saw in the film. They are thought of as commodities, not as sentient beings that have feelings and that have the right to a life that is a nice cow's life or a nice chicken's life. Chickens have their beaks cut off. They are squashed into cages way too small. Very often cows are turned into carnivores. They are fed the leftovers of meat byproducts that nobody wants to eat, and it goes on and on. So that's an ethical issue. When I first taught my courses at the Unitarian Society, I went back to the classics of ancient literature, and the vegetarians like Pythagoras of ancient literature, and what they thought about meat eating and why they didn't want to do it. And one of the arguments that came out again and again and again was that the violence you do to another being is the violence that you do to yourself, because that changes you to be violent, to kill. And I think about these poor people who, for the necessity of $1 and a livelihood, are the slaughterers in these slaughterhouses. I mean, what does it do to these people as human beings? And we like to sanitize our relationship to animal products by buying them in supermarkets where they're all clean and lovely and beautiful, but it is something to think about. And then the point that they touched on that is really important is the world hunger issue. That would be the third concern. So what we do to attain, thank you, what we do to attain our meat is to funnel it in our protein source in a very inefficient way. John Robbins, in one of his books, says that it takes 16 pounds of protein, plant-based protein, to produce 1 pound of meat. Okay? Frances Moore LaPay and her daughter Anna LaPay, who were just at UCSB, I don't know if any of you heard her speak. I went down and listened to her. And they talk, their message is that it's an abundant earth we live on, but it is our ways of eating and our ways of thinking that produce these ways of eating that turn abundance into scarcity and poverty, so that people in the world are starving. And not only in the world, even in our own country. You can go to southern Appalachia, and I spent 2 summers there and saw kids with distended stomachs who were drawing stick figures in the 8th grade because they were malnourished, and they were malnourished because of our food distribution system. So this is an ethical issue. And then the environmental results. They touched on some in the film: global warming, for sure, the dead zones, but deforestation, soil erosion, water depletion, which we're experiencing, the fossil fuel implications. These are all areas of concern, and we could spend hours on any one of these and trot out shocking facts about what we are doing. And the clock is ticking. And if we all, like, you don't have to go whole hog. You don't have to say, I'll never eat another slice of meat again. But if you just reduced your consumption, start with 1 day a week, move to 2 days a week, then move to 3 days a week, substitute wild-caught fish for meat products, and so on and so forth. So we can turn this around, and the clock is ticking, and we need to do it soon, because otherwise the next generation may experience more severe consequences than we would like to think about.
Solution.
Yes.
Okay.
What I would like to say is that a lot of the thinking in that film and in our Western-based science is more structural, and the Asian systems that are responsible for macrobiotics are more vitalistic in their understanding of how to approach the problem. So it's a difference in worldview. Whereas you might hear about the particular chemical composition of a food or the particular issues related to your health from the Western perspective, you will hear about the energetic issues involved in the food or in your body from the Asian perspective. So macrobiotics is a 20th century system. It's pretty much second half of the 20th century, but its roots are in the mid 20th century. The term is really stolen from a 17th century German doctor who introduced the word macrobiotics, but it is appropriated and reinvented by macrobiotic leaders and teachers. It means long life or great life, literally macro great, and bios, the Greek for life. And it's a way of life based on food practices that come out of several hundred years of Japanese food philosophy as studied and experimented with by George Osawa, and the foremost American teacher in this country has been the Japanese immigrant Michio Kushi, who founded the Kushi Institute. And as I explained earlier, he just died in December 28th of this year. So it's based on the idea that everything is living energy. You've heard of qi in Chinese. In Japanese, they call it ki. It's the same basic concept. And the South Asian equivalent would be prana, the breath, the term for breath. And that this energy moves through all things. And George Osawa used to talk about the unique principle, and that term dialectical, as somebody pointed out on our break, is really his way of talking about that. That the most ancient philosophical concept in China, which then comes over to Japan, the Japanese always kind of take used Chinese concepts and reinvent them, so that's what happens here, are the idea of yin and yang. And the terms come from Chinese early observations of what grows on the sunny side of the mountain and what grows on the shady side of the mountain. And the shady side of the mountain is the yin side, and it's more sheltered, it's more moist, it's more expansive because more grows there, the moss grows there, it won't grow on the sunny side. The sunny side is drier, it's more contracted, and you could come up with a whole series of dualism based on these ideas of yin and yang. Yin is considered female, yang is considered male. Night is considered yin, day is considered yang. Spring is, as a season, is considered yin, winter is considered yang. Cold is considered yang, heat is considered yin, or maybe it's the reverse, and so on and so forth. So in other words, it's a way of classifying all of what we see in the world in terms of these dualities. After some time, the Chinese began to complicate that picture, and they began to think in terms of 5 transformations, or sometimes it's called 5 elements, but it's more 5 transformations, because their idea was that things are always moving, things are always changing. That's the qi principle. And so the 5 transformations are wood or tree, as it's sometimes called, fire, soil, metal, and water. And they made correlations between those 5 different elements and different seasons of the year. Like spring would be wood, it's upward rising energy, like a tree coming up. Fire, summer, the hottest time of the year, the energy is really bubbling up and out all over the place. Indian summer, there's more of a gathering kind of period when the days are growing a little bit shorter and things are just gently contracting a little bit. Fall, the metal, things are most contracted, they're most hard. So that's the really most young part of this. And then water, also young, but also a kind of floating energy that they often attribute to water, because it's out of the water that's going to come the new birth, that is the springtime. So they thought of all of life in those kinds of terms, and if you look at these books, you will find all these correlations between what's tree energy and what's wood energy and what is metal energy. And there's a kind of relationship between these. There's a cycle that is considered the cycle of production, or the cycle of support from one to the next. So you go around the chart in a clockwise direction, and water supports the growth of wood, right, tree. You need water to get a tree. The tree is burned and you get fire. Once that happens, the remnants congeal and you have soil. The soil gets hardened and you get metal, and the metal is tempered, or tempers the water. And then you have a cycle of antagonism between these. So if you skip from one to the next, metal will cut down a tree, okay, so that's cutting down the wood. Wood will erode the soil. Think of a big tree and how it's producing that. And so they make these kinds of correlations. So it's a kind of poetic way of looking at life and looking at the process of nature and how it all works and how it all fits together. It's aesthetic. It's beautiful. The Chinese always do this. I do Tai Chi, and the moves always have these names, like stork spreading its wings, you know, something like that. So it's never just an analytical term. It's always this aesthetic kind of thing. So into the system is inserted our own bodies. So for example, with metal energy, the organ systems that are related to metal energy are the lungs and the large intestine. Related to water are the kidney and the bladder. Some of these are pretty intuitive, and you know, you can see kidney and bladder right away, right? Wood energy, liver and gallbladder. Fire is the heart and the small intestine. And soil, the stomach, the spleen, and the pancreas. As they began to think about these, this is the basis of the acupuncture system and the system of Chinese herbs. As they began to think about this, they began to think about the foods and the herbs and the diseases that would fit into each category. So metal diseases would be intestinal problems and lung problems, and the remedies would be herbs and foods that support these, and so on and so forth around the chart. So if you are just trying to live your life and stay happy and healthy and in balance, the issue becomes, how do I prevent myself from moving too far in a yin direction or a yang direction? How do I prevent myself from giving too much to the wood side of the transformation, or too little to this side? And so the way of eating that is recommended is a system that is a kind of fluid living balance. So you can't say go to a macrobiotic teacher and say, well, what should I do about my bronchitis, and get a remedy and then continue to eat the same way for the rest of your life because you got that remedy for that, because you are moving, changing, and that will not work. You have to keep being sensitive, being attuned, being intuitive about what you need at any particular point. Macrobiotic teaching suggests that we all come into the world with a certain basic constitution. We can pretty much assess the constitutions of different people by looking at their body shapes, by looking at their physiognomic features. For example, my friend right here to the right of me, he has a lot of tree energy because his, this is macrobiotic thinking, his face is shaped like a triangle. and that would be tree energy. So we know that we have a tree person here, bubbling, upward rising energy. So they do a lot of that. The other thing that is done is to talk about your condition, because we all come with basic constitutions. Some people may come with very strong constitutions, like you've probably seen pictures of the Buddha, and the Buddha has these elongated earlobes. Okay, that is a very young and very longevity-prone constitution, somebody with a large detached earlobe. Somebody else may have a small earlobe that's set higher up, and that would be a more yin type of constitution. But that basic constitution is altered by condition. Condition means where you live, how you work, how you play, how you eat, and what your stress factors are. So all of that you can have somebody that might have a very young constitution, but because of their location, they live in India, they have a very erratic lifestyle, they're bubbling extremely all the time. They might have a very, 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 very yin constitution or condition. So what you do with macrobiotic teaching is to figure out how to balance all of that. Who you are, what you came in with, what you've become, and where you live, and how you work, and how you play. So it's an art form. It's not a fixed one-size-fits-all approach. In macrobiotic thinking, the best foods for anybody are locally grown foods, because these foods support the balanced energy of a person in a particular place at a particular time. So eating in Santa Barbara, where we have a subtropical climate, a Mediterranean climate, it's basically different from eating if you live in India or if you live on the Fiji Islands. So we don't have coconuts falling on our heads, we don't have pineapples growing in our gardens, so these become, in macrobiotic thinking, extreme foods for this climate, not for somebody who lives in those other climates. That's food as usual, but in our climate they become foods that really are going to require a lot of balancing to keep our bodies healthy and happy. And that is a challenge for our times, because we have such a global culture, right? With, you walk into the supermarket and grapes are out of season in this climate, but I walked into Whole Foods and there were these Chilean grapes there. So they were imported from South America, where we're supposed to be in winter. We're not, but we are supposed to be in winter and they're in summer, so that we get that now. And so that's not in season now. Okay, but they're available, so that becomes an issue for us. Like how much are we going to do that? Because these items in macrobiotic thinking put a stress on our bodies when they're out of season. So locally grown, in season, organically grown. In other words, without the use of pesticides and nitrogen-based artificial fertilizers. All of that becomes part of the equation. So figuring out the best thing to eat is different day by day, different depending on where you live, and different in terms of your condition. So if you have a very tight condition, one that we would call yang in macrobiotics, you're very contracted, you have a high stress job, and you got a million things to do and you got to get them done before dinner, you need to eat foods that help you relax. Go have a big salad, have some fruit, do something to get yourself to react. Whereas your friend here is come day, go day, God's and Sunday. Yeah, I got 35 things to do, but who cares? That guy needs some really young food, needs some tight, hard, contracting food to put a fire under him to get him to go. So that's the beauty of the system, that it really complexifies, complicates, and helps you to adjust to your situation. So, how is this different from the vegan approach that was propounded in this film and that we saw? That film was great, and those guys are fellow travelers. They're saying cut down on meat. I think that's a great idea for all the reasons I expressed. But what we have there is a one-size-fits-all approach, right? Everybody should eat the same way. And what we have here is, no, you're all different. And if you all eat the same way, it's not going to have the same results in all of you. Some of you will thrive on it, and you'll just be the happiest and the healthiest you've ever been. But some people will start having ailments, and they have to figure out what to do. So this approach gives you a way to think through those issues in a much more nuanced way than I think pure and simple veganism does. In terms of what Macrobiotic teaches in terms of that balance, they classify all foods on this yin and yang spectrum. So yang foods are considered contractive, and if you call contraction the same thing as yang, you'll be on the right track and it won't be as confusing. So foods that are contracting are yang. Foods that are expansive are yin foods. So a yang food would be meat, contracting, salt, contracting, hard, baked, dry flour products like chips would be contracting. Yin foods would be alcohol. Think of how alcohol makes you expand and get friendly and happy and everything. Marijuana, very but also fruits and vegetables are gently yin, and grains are usually gently yin. Okay, so the idea in macrobiotics is that we all instinctively seek a balance between yang foods and yin foods. But if we eat extremely yang foods and extremely yin foods, it's like being on a seesaw. And so one side goes down, one side goes up. One side goes down, one side goes up. Eating a lot of yang foods will set up a craving for yin foods. So the classic example that they always talk about is the steak and martini lunch that the businessman has, okay, right? He goes out, has his tri-tip, and he really needs that martini because he has eaten something extremely yang and his body is craving a balance, and so you get the extremely yin martini to balance that. But the thinking is, if you are eating extremely yang and extremely yin, what are you doing? You're spending a lot of energy balancing between opposites, and that's energy that you cannot use to live your life and to pursue your passions and your dreams and your projects, because you're wasting your life energy doing this balancing act, and you're inviting the kind of stress that are going to make you vulnerable to diseases. So the idea is to eat in a more centered way to eat in a more balanced way. And that means that extreme foods in macrobiotic thinking become, for this climate, foods like meats, okay, and a lot of very contracted products, a lot of hard dairy products. On the other hand, the soft dairy products like the cottage cheese type cheeses and milk and that kind of thing become more yin than is good usually for somebody. So the idea is that you end up in a place that's similar to the vegan dietary recommendations, but you do them from a different perspective, and you do them in terms of where you are in terms of your own health situation. So when I started macrobiotics, I was vegan. At first I was vegetarian. I had a beloved cat, and after she lived with me for 3 years, it was like, well, animals are people too. And I wouldn't eat Samantha, so why am I eating cows and chickens and other animals? So it was just like, because I loved animals, that I became vegetarian. And then I started having health issues, and a holistic doctor told me to cut out dairy from my life, and I did, so I was vegan. And I was dragging around. And I was taking cooking classes in Ohio, and a macrobiotic counselor from the Kushi Institute came through town. He gave some lectures, blew my mind away with the content of these lectures, so I thought, hey, I'm going to go and get a consultation with this guy. So I did. And he said, you need to eat fish. You need to eat it at least twice a week. And it was like, I don't eat animal products. I don't eat animal products. He said, you are thinking dualistically. Pray to attract a fish that wants to become a part of you. I never, yeah, what he said. So, yeah, this is a very different approach from the vegan approach, right? That means that in terms of pure veganism, macrobiotics is not pure. And because it's based on an energetic idea and the energies that the person had. I was too yin in these terms. I needed to get some more yang into my system. Okay? So that is a brief summary. We could go on and on and on about the differences. At the very center of this is the use of cereal grains, and Michio Kushi had a theory about how the birth of agriculture was really related to the efflorescence of civilizations, and how grains were at the very heart and center of agriculture, and so that was good food for humans. And so when I first started macrobiotics, people ate way more grain than they do today. And of course they were eating grain from Massachusetts, where Michio Kushi was living, and that was a more cold climate, and it required more young food to balance it. And now I eat less grain, and I advise people to eat less grain than he was advising then, but it's still a lot more grain than most people eat. Like if I just had a plate, probably a quarter of the plate would have some form of whole grain on it, okay? So I guess that's all I want to say, because I want to get us into some discussion. What time?